lot to do. So yeah, I've been getting stuck into that. Yeah, which has been good. Yeah.
I was
So you wanted to talk about reading today, didn't you? That was one of the main things.
I did, because I think one of the things we randomly started seeing each other's posts, I think, but you know, I mean, you've been running a business. I was looking at a post before about 20 years of All Conditions. I think it is All Conditions Media.
All Conditions Media, my company is, yeah.
And some of the lessons in that, and I think that the business model will need to keep evolving. You've obviously been doing something for a long time in a space that's moved loads. It's sport, it's a different sporting background from me. I was kind of in rugby mostly, and then in sort of sport adjacent startups until I've been doing what I'm doing now and writing books and doing book content and stuff. But also you're publishing those reading lists and all the books you're reading. So I think, I love this crossover between sport and adventure, and then also reading. You're like you're adventuring like through that medium as well, which I think was really cool. So you just had so many things that I was like, wow, what a fascinating guy.
That's very kind of you to say. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Like when you've done, like you say, I mean, because you're a professional sports person, right? And your sport was rugby, I believe, right? And so how long have you been kind of not professional, if I can put it that way?
Yeah, quite a long time now, because I've been unprofessional probably as long as I
don't want to say retired.
no, but it's true, and it's like the semantics of it are quite interesting. And someone was saying, "Oh, you wouldn't, if someone stopped being a lawyer and became a teacher, you wouldn't say they've retired from the law." But
exactly.
But actually, you sort of do retire from sport. I don't know. It's I'm not that precious about it, but I've probably been retired unprofessional for about as long as I actually was contracted in the end, because.
Sure.
And then I had a similar amount of time as a sort of serious academy, through to senior rugby, semi-pro stuff while I was studying and all that stuff. So, I mean, I probably spent 15 years, 16 years in and around like kind of the professional rugby pipeline and the actual game as an adult, and then I've been out of it for about 7 or 8 years now. So it does feel quite remote, and also with the pandemic, like you said, that was a real kind of line in the sand, and I'd stopped playing probably 2 years before that happened. So it's I don't know, it does feel a long way away now, and so when I talk about it, it does feel quite distant. And having done a couple of like book projects in and around that as well, those act as like natural capstones to your time. Like when you see a band, like sometimes when I go and see a band live, that's almost like the end of my relationship with them. I sort of stop listening to them for a bit, because I'm like, I've seen you, and I don't know, there's this weird sort of end to a period. And sport is kind of, I've gone a long way away from it in a way, and I always consider, it's always at the back of my mind, or should I get back in some capacity? I'm not sure.
Did you have a plan? Like, did you, because one of the big cliches obviously about professional sports people is the kind of lack of duty of care for people that dedicate their lives to this thing from a really young age. And then, it's a brutal business, isn't it? I mean, I know through my work, I'm friends with a lot of professional like skateboarders, snowboarders, surfers. And I think one thing that all professional elite athletes have in common, right, is that it's a young person's game. And once the age kicks in, it's not a sentimental business, is it? You kind of like that's the end of that, really. And notoriously, there isn't a lot of duty of care, is there? There isn't really like a retirement sort of program. And you strike me as somebody who's obviously, got angles, let's put it that way. So did you always have a bit of an idea of what you might do when the end came from your professional elite sport career?
Not really. I mean, what I was always trying to do was kind of accrue options and skills and potential avenues, but I think I could have benefited from a little bit more rigor and a little bit more thought. I mean, I got a degree, English literature, useful for everything and nothing. I always thought, beautiful. I was always sort of, I could do my law conversion and do that, but then, actually being a lawyer, the idea of that didn't really appeal to me at all. And And then I was always picking up little things. So I got my kind of rugby coaching badges. I got my teaching English as a foreign language. I could have maybe gone to Hong Kong and had the kind of semi-pro deload and done some work and played rugby alongside it. But in the end,
Is that like the Saudi contract for like Premier League players kind of thing? Yeah.
it's like that with way, way less money. And
yeah.
But I never had a clear idea. And I think what got me in the end was that I just went back to kind of my childhood interests, which were always books. You know, books and sports were just my things. And and that's kind of what the threads I ended up pulling on were all around writing and books, and then content more belatedly in a way. And I actually I had a real disdain actually for social media and that sort of stuff while I was playing rugby. And it was I always say now it was a failure of imagination on my part, where I could have been playing rugby but talking about books instead. And I just saw how people used it in that regard, and I just didn't like it. But that was actually my mistake. And now I really like making content. So I think when you're sort of figuring out that transition out, you need to kind of test your own assumptions a lot, because you think, oh, I don't like that. No, that's not me. That's not who I am. And actually, you change and you grow up. And
No, it's really interesting. On the English lit thing, I mean, it's quite a cliche for people that did English as a degree, right? Like, but it did take me quite a few years to enjoy reading again after I did an English degree. I mean, I look back on my English degree and I just think, fucking hell, you were too young to do that. I was 18 when I did my English degree, and I just look back now and I'm like, that was a waste of everyone's time. Because I wasn't that conscientious, you might say. And also I just found the absolute meta-analysis of everything to the nth degree. Like, just it definitely took me a few years before I enjoyed reading for pleasure again. You didn't have...
how did that come about for you? What was the sort of, can you remember what the kind
I
of
always read. I always carried on reading, but like just to actually enjoy a book for what it is, like without overanalyzing it to death, And also, like, I think when you're a kid growing up reading, and I think probably we're a bit similar if we've like, it sounds like you're probably like me, you've been a big reader your whole life, right? Like, and from an early part of your childhood, I imagine, and I was the same. So it's kind of a big part of my identity, I think, is what I'm getting at. And like that, when you're young and pretentious, means that you definitely read books that are probably, there's the whole like, oh, I'll read an improving book thing, and plow through shit that you're probably not enjoying too much. And like, as you get a bit older, obviously then you're a bit like, actually, I don't need to do that. I just can read what I want and not analyze everything to death, and just enjoy it for the... I was definitely... that was definitely part of it in my early 20s for sure. Yeah. But a question for you then, like, so what you talked about, when you... sport and reading being your twin passions, like, so what do you remember, like, what it was do you remember when you realized that you were a reader, if you like, let's put it that way?
I think a bit like you, I can never really remember not reading. And one of my oldest childhood friend says he remembers after I'd been round to play and my mum came to pick me up, and I said bye and got in the back of the car and opened my book, and he was waiting for me to wave at him, but I was just sort of, face down.
Yeah, you were engrossed.
Exactly, yeah. And it's just always been a thing for me. I've never, I really can't remember ever not doing it at all. And, at school when you had a kind of minimum, they'd be like, oh, read 4 pages and write it in your little journal. And there'd always be these, a little bit like you, I was a sort of pretentious child, but I would always do that. And then I'd hammer through something else. And I was just constantly reading. And one of the best things my parents did for me was never let me have a games console. So we lived in the middle of nowhere, and, only had the kind of standard TV channels. So there was nothing to watch, and I used to just put it on in the background and then just read all night once it was dark because I had nothing else to do. So yeah.
Reading limits with torture. I agree with that. Yeah. And do you remember? Was there a book that that you look back on when you were a kid that had like a significant impact on you?
I loved sort of adventure and fantasy stuff. So I think my kind of trajectory went adventure type things. And I remember there's a guy, and he's kind of, I think he's sort of been ushered aside because of the, these books are quite old, but there's a guy called Willard Price, and they were all
Yeah, I
sort of,
remember him.
yeah, and I think he was a diplomat, probably a spy in real life, and he was
Yeah.
going around the world. And so there were all these stories about these, I think they were kind of conservationist brothers with like sort of doing things, and they're going volcano adventure and Amazon adventure, and then there's lots of sort of suspicious descriptions of the natives and that sort of thing. But
Yeah,
they were
yeah.
they
So
were
I
real
so
kind of
I
romps,
read a
weren't
lot of
they?
I read a lot of Wilbur Smith when I was a kid.
Yes, okay.
It's similar ballpark.
Yeah.
And weirdly enough, like last year, I got asked to be a judge on the Wilbur Smith Adventure Writing Prize, which was a very funny full circle moment. Completely out of nowhere, like, and that it turns out that's actually like a big thing. Like, and they, it's like because I mean I don't want to turn into some like Wilbur Smith stan, but like essentially, like he's one of the most successful writers ever, right? So he's got a huge
Mm,
estate. He's dead now, and they one of the things his estate does is run this literary award, and it is about like trying to encourage young authors, and it's called the Adventure Writing Prize. So I got asked to judge that, and I had to, and they also asked me to be a pundit on the Wilbur Smith podcast. This is about a year ago. It was completely random. I was here actually. Um, so obviously I said yes because I was like, well, why not? So I had to reread a load of Wilbur Smith books so I could
oh wow.
be a pundit on this podcast because that was one of the sillier things I suggested in recent years because they wanted me to be like it was about the First World War. That it was like, can you come in and be the expert on Wilbur's take on the First World War? I was like, I guess so. So I ended up reading about 5 Wilbur Smith books, and let me tell you, they've not aged very well. They talk about like dodgy descriptions of the natives, and yeah, it was really interesting actually going back and thinking because I read those books when I was like 12, 13, I would say.
Mm,
So this is like late 80s, early 1990s, you know what I mean? And I ended up reading them because I got this, I grew up in Manchester and I got this job, I got my first job when I was like 13. And I was working in this carpet shop in the middle of Manchester. And the guy that ran it, who was like classic working class, sort of mank, but like basically an intellectual, but he never had the.
mm.
It's a bit of an old story. Do you know what I
Like an
mean? Like,
autodidact kind of thing. He
yeah,
like
like,
followed
and
his
he was a
own.
huge reader, and and he was a macho kind of bloke. He was talking like 1989, 1990 in the middle of
Mm.
Manchester. So, but on the sly, he was like a bit of a closet intellectual, and he'd read a lot, and he had this full shelf of like Wilbur Smith books. So when I started working for him when I was like 13, I ended up basically reading this whole like oeuvre, you might say, and yeah, it was pretty funny. I actually met his wife who last year when I did that gig, and she was very tickled by that story. He loved the story of Stratford Carpet Centre and 13-year-old me reading reading her husband's books. But yeah, like it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I was a huge Enid Blyton fan
Mm.
when I was like, and
Yeah,
they've also
similar
not aged.
stuff.
They've also not aged very well. I'm gonna say. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but like one of the things I thought because equally I looked into what you've been up to as well, and perhaps you could explain like it seems like you're really making the connect. You're on a mission to make young boys read more. It would
Mm.
seem like, and so tell me about that. Like, tell me why that's important and some of the work that you've been doing there.
I think,
And for beer number 2, if that's all right.
yeah, no, go for it. I'm just envious. Yeah, I just love it, and I know what it's kind of done for me and given me. And actually, even in people often say, "Oh, were people like sort of weird about it in rugby environments?" So I say, "Well, no, people were kind of curious, and then you give them a bit of time, and then they'd suddenly start asking you for recommendations." And I think that's sort of what I see with the schoolwork I'm doing as well. People are a bit sort of, oh, this is weird, and a bit to what you're talking about earlier with the kind of academic line of inquiry that you're forced to take with books. You see them as
Yeah, yeah,
homework and as a sort of, yeah, there's all this meta-analysis and you don't get to actually enjoy what you're doing. And I think we get to have these discussions around the books. We read the odd book together and then we talk about them, but in a kind of low key way and use them as a window to talk about other things. And then it helps them sort of see why you would bother reading. I know
yeah.
Ernest Hemingway. We did The Old Man and the Sea, and they love. I think with boys as well, they get patronized a lot in that respect. So you go, okay, no,
Sure.
here's a great book. Here's like one of the greats, and we're going to read it. And it's not a test, and you can say anything you want, and I don't mind, but I'm going to hold you accountable to that, and I'm going to challenge
Yeah,
you and all that stuff, but in a respectful way. And I just think that there's this big gap between boys and girls that starts right away. And it seems that some of the things are sort of relatively simple to address. And if you have role models in your life that read, and if your parents, if your father reads, or if you're a man and you give people books, there's a sort of that there's these very small but very powerful ways that you can kind of seed it for the next bunch. And I think getting boys into reading, it helps them academically, it helps them socially. There's all these different ways. And the work we've done in school has been a real rising tide
cool.
that lifts all boats, because it just has all these other knock-on effects. And I think being someone who they would regard as maybe an atypical reader, like, there's this like rugby lad here to talk to you about books, and to begin with they're a bit like, what is going on? And we end up having a good time, and then they usually say, when you're coming back? And then I think that's the other bit that's very powerful. If you can do something with a group where you do come back, so it's pretty easy to kind of to go once. And
Yeah,
unfortunately with a lot of places, like, that's all they have capacity for, or that's all you have capacity for. But there's such a lot of power in coming back and committing, because I think a lot of these guys, like young guys, they're used to people sort of dropping them, or just like telling
yeah,
them
yeah,
something and
yeah,
leaving. Whereas if you come back, they go, oh wow. And even there was one group who didn't read the book, most of them, and then we actually got to have a quite helpful discussion about, oh look, I've committed to you, but you've not fulfilled the commitment we made last time. Like,
yeah,
and they were embarrassed, and you can kind of see, even that interaction is quite productive, and it's sort of
yeah. That account, like that, making them accountable for
exactly.
even for not doing it. Yeah,
Mm,
yeah. But role models is interesting, isn't it? I think that's certainly something that when I look back was important. I think, like to have people that almost wreck it, like, not I mean, it's not to overstate it, but like just almost encouraged it in me.
mm.
Like,
Who did that for you?
well, I had a couple of teachers. I mean, it's quite an old story, isn't it? But like, I had a couple of teachers who, I mean, it was really formative in what I ended up doing. Like, because
Mm.
like I, like a lot of kids, was really kind of, I guess, age 13, 14, I was like, what the fuck am I going to do here? You know what I mean? And I basically had a couple of English teachers who were like, you can write, really, and your interest in literature and books is a good foundation for a career. Like, it's something that you could definitely um like make a living out of. And at the age of 14, that was obviously quite a revelatory thing. And they also really encouraged me to write, like, and that was about the age when I sort of thought, oh, maybe I'll, like, you're like, oh, what should I do? And I was like, journalism, maybe I could become a journalist. And I think what you were saying earlier about how your passion for sport and literature kind of intertwined, like, that was definitely how it was for me, because that was the age I started getting into like skateboarding and snowboarding, and not surfing. That came a lot later. um and I was a bit like, I was a big consumer of skate and snowboard mags,
Mm.
and they were like a very, very creative, fertile world. And again, this is going back a few years, so it's pre-internet. So like, incredibly creative, and also like really talented people involved, really talented photographers, really talented writers, really talented designers. Um, and I kind of thought maybe I could do that. Maybe that's what I could do. And that's what I ended up doing. Basically, I ended up getting the first part of my career. I ran snowboard magazines from when I was quite young. From when I was like started writing for snowboard magazines when I was probably like 19, 18, 19 when I was at university. And then when I left university, um, I was 21. That was like 1997. And I got a job straight away, like as editor of a snowboard magazine. Um, and then I did that for like 10 years, which was like an incredible gig. But that very much came from those role models, basically, at that really formative age, just give me that little nudge and just saying like, this has got value, like, and you're, you should nurture this. And like, I still really owe those two teachers a lot, really. And yeah, and it's an important thing, isn't it? Like to have people that can, especially like you say, if you're, because I'll be honest, like a bit like what you're talking about. When I was a kid, there weren't a lot of other lads my age like doing a lot of reading. You know what I mean? Or wanted to be writers. So like, um, it almost gives you the kind of vindication, permission, doesn't it, to sort of that maybe what you're interested in has value, which is important, isn't it? I think.
For sure. And I think what you're saying, the sort of scene that you got into, what was it very cool. It still is cool, but I think at the time it had this like underground kind of vibe to it. Maybe it was outside the mainstream. It was quite punk. Like there were all these
Yeah, I
design
think back
things
then it
going on.
was. I
Yeah.
think back then it was. I mean, I think the analogy that everyone would use about that is like, everyone always talks about like the DIY sort of thing
The
with like punk,
zines and stuff.
punk especially.
Yeah.
But and I do think like back then that there was I think those words did apply, like counterculture, like DIY, like I think what it taught me back then was like no one knew what they were doing, which was a very important lesson because I remember like um I remember turning up in that world, getting that job that I described, and having a lot of ideas, and because I'd been essentially through the voracious reading that I'd been doing my whole life, I, I didn't realize it, but I'd been taking notes, so I had a lot of ideas, and people were immediately like, yeah, you can do that. Like that's kind of how I got that job, like I as the editor of that snowboard magazine, because they were a bit like, oh, right, you can actually do that. Okay, you got the job. Like because there was no one else that could kind of do it. So I do think those words, and certainly that is like that DIY sort of creative strand is very much still. I'm still lucky enough to work in that world. I still write for those magazines. The podcast that I do is very much based around all this stuff. And those things are still coherent themes that run through it. I think, quite obviously outwardly now, they're much more, I mean, they're in the Olympics. So,
Yeah.
pretty mainstream these days.
What were you reading then? Then you said you'd done all this reading, like quite a lot of it was probably for university. But what was the stuff that was really informing, your note taking? What were the things that you were kind of personally turned on
Yeah,
by?
I mean, I was an avid consumer of the media. I was reading everything I could get my hands on. Back then, and I sound like quite an old fart, really. Keep saying this, but but like I say, there wasn't a lot of media.
Mm.
So magazines were sort of gold dust, and videos were gold dust. There was that, like you would literally, if there was one shop in Manchester that sold like Thrasher. So I would go, you'd go and buy that. You'd buy all the English mags and so on. Um, but I was just like, growing up, like my reading pattern growing up was probably like pretty cliched, really, I would say. I mean, I read a lot of like, in my teens, reading like the Beats. Do you know what I mean? I was reading like a lot of Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, like all that shit. And like I probably followed like a pretty well-worn path thinking back of like, and I think a lot of that again is to do with like the reference points that were sort of available because because I was really and still am like really into music and passionate about music. So a lot of it was just like reading interviews with musicians who would name drop writers and, you know, and then you'd go down those little rabbit holes. And also like, cause I was doing English lit and doing an English degree, like I was reading, you know, you get grounded in the sort of classics, don't you? Um, so yeah, like because I studied English from, I guess seriously, I guess you think like GCSEs to sort of like end of the degrees, probably like 7 years, right? So um, you get through a lot of the classics really. Um, but I try to think if anything sort of stands out from that era.
I think though that also maybe part of it is that those writers lived extreme lives, and so even if you weren't that bothered about the work, you know, those older writers, they were out there in the world doing kind of crazy things. Whereas,
Yeah, that was definitely part of the appeal. There's no doubt about that.
yeah,
Like, you know,
was it?
I think when you're a kid, like there's a reason why teenagers read On the Road, right? Like
Mm.
like there's and I imagine it's still a bit of a there's a reason why you end up reading those kind of cult alternative classics, right? Because you're looking for a direction, aren't you? You know, um you're looking for like models to sort of follow. I mean, one of the great privileges of what I've been doing in the last few years through Looking Sideways is I've had the chance to sort of pay homage to some of the journalists and photographers who really influenced me through surf skate and snowboarding. Like, and I had so there was a magazine in the UK called Read and Destroy, which was the skate mag when I was growing up. For me, it was like this, you know, I just imagined it was run by people who had their shit together, you know, because it was a huge influence on me and my friends. And then and then it all went sort of tits up and like, you know, and it's become this like legendary thing, Read and Destroy. It's like the old, you know, Velvet Underground first album. Only 1,000 people bought it, but everyone who did formed a band, sort of thing. It's like got this like hugely influential reach through not only skateboarding but through surfing, like through British board sports culture. So when I started Looking Sideways, the podcast, I was like, I'm going to interview the guy who edited that, like a guy called Tim Leighton Boyce, who was like um, easily one of the most influential people in British action sports culturally. No one's ever heard of him, obviously, if you didn't grow up with it, but absolutely true that he is. So I was fortunate enough to interview him. Um, and he was just quite baffled, I think, like because at that point he was like about 60. Um, And he'd like left skateboarding behind. Like since then, he's actually got his due because there's been a book and like exhibitions and but then it was probably like 6 years ago. No one was really that asked. So like for me to, you know, I was geeking out. I was like, look, I really just need you to know that like you had a big influence on my career. And like you know, I wanted to give him his due, do you know what I mean? And and he was like, you should have pitched me.
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, I would have published you. He was like, we couldn't get anyone to fucking write for us. And I was like, he was like, honestly, if you'd written me a letter, I would have absolutely commissioned you. I was like, fuck.
That's such,
'Cause
I think that's such a salient lesson though, isn't it? Whereas like you assume that these things are like, oh, that it works really well and it's out of my reach
he
and
was
stuff.
like,
But
we didn't have a clue what we were doing. Like he was like, I couldn't find it. You know, he's like, well, you thought it was like this really together thing, and I was like, well, yeah, like. He's like, yeah, no, that's not how it was. Yeah, but that's been lovely to. I've had a couple of them. There's a journalist and a photographer from the States called Kevin Peterson and Craig Peterson, sorry, and Kevin Norton. These two legendary surf travelers back on the old like Jack Kerouac kind of lifestyle tip. They wrote this like they had a 10-year stretch basically. They spent the 70s traveling the world and writing for Surfer Mag. and those stories are like they basically like wrote the template for certainly the career that I ended up having, and the career that a lot of my friends have ended up having, where you travel like chasing these things. And I was lucky enough to sort of, they were also on the list. I was like, right, I'm going to interview them too as well. And they were, yeah, they were equally kind of like, okay, this is cool, but you know, it's just nice to be able to sort of get, you know, give your antecedents, give your influences the respect they deserve, really.
I think there's something as well about blokes not being very good at taking compliments. So if there's like someone who's like super earnest and just like, oh, you know, I
They
love
were definitely like, why is this weird English guy comes to California? Why is he? No, they were cool though. I think they were kind of thrilled. You know, they were like, wow, okay, this is nice.
well,
So tell
I
me about like
oh sorry.
your book projects then. So you know, like, so you tell me about what happened when you you know, you said you, to pick up the thread of what you were talking about earlier then. So you finished your career and you were I asked you like if you had a plan, and you said that you were like, okay, books, reading, and then we talked a little bit about your kind of outreach work. But like, how did it develop for you then after you know the retirement in inverted commas?
I I started well while I was playing every so often, and not in a rigorous way, but every so often people would ask me to like look over bits of writing, or a friend was working for a trend analyst, so he would send me stuff about rugby and, you know, could you contribute to this, that sort of stuff. And there was a guy who he actually started an online rugby magazine, and the first year as a professional, he said, do you want to do a column about, you know, the competition you're playing in? And we only did about 5 issues maybe, and he got offered a very good job at ESPN. So he just
Right.
left and he's still there. So that was a really interesting kind of DIY project, and the proof early on of, oh, random stuff you do online can really
Yeah.
kind of result
Yeah. Yeah.
in real world outcomes. So I'd always kind of had writing in the back of my mind as like a future endeavor. And once I stopped playing, I started doing little courses. I did a free Open University thing about writing fiction, but that just got me contributing. And I started doing writing for kind of rugby guys who had their own businesses and that sort of stuff, like thought leadership, ghostwriting type things.
Yeah.
As soon as when I put something online for the first time as myself, I just put some clickbaity thing on LinkedIn and got offered some blogging work, which was terrible pay, but it just got me used to kind of pitching and
Yeah.
coming up with my own ideas. But I was coming up with ideas that were not useful for them, but I was just sort of filling them out as practice, really. And just through doing that, I got the concept for this book together, which ended up being my first book, Fringes, Life on the Edge of Professional Rugby, about professional sport, like just outside the limelight, where you're doing it and you're being
Yeah.
paid, but you're not doing what you thought you might be doing.
Oh, I'd love to read that. Just to jump in, there's a couple of, do you know the Paul Kimmage book?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a classic, right? Or similar
Mm.
theme. What's it? Do you remember what it's called? Do you know the one I mean, right? Like,
No, I do know what you mean. I love cycling
yeah,
books. I do. I
yeah,
think,
like 1990 maybe. Like after he'd done a couple of
yeah.
tours, really famous kind of lid lifting expose
Mm.
on. And then there's that tennis one out at the minute, isn't there?
Exactly. Yeah. Just won the William Hill Sportsbook of the Year. I
I'm
can't.
not doing well on the actual names of these
Yeah.
references,
It
but
might be called Racket or something, but there is.
so that kind of vibe, as in like, you know, not like the reality of like the day-to-day life of professional
Mm.
sport, away from like the kind of banner individuals who get the press and the attention sort of thing.
Yeah, most of those books are quite boring, I find, or particularly the rugby ones. You know, they're people are, you know, they they tell you lots of things you sort of already know or have seen. And I thought I actually have a good opportunity to differentiate by going, you know, who the people I'm talking about are not necessarily famous rugby players, although a few of them have become, you know, pretty successful. So I felt like I had a lot more freedom to say, oh, this is what it's actually like. This is what's actually going on. This is how people actually regard these things. And I set it over the 4 years that I was in Rouen in Normandy, which was, you know, I was in my
Down
mid
the
20s.
road.
Exactly. Yeah. I was in my
Yeah, yeah.
mid 20s, and I was thinking, you know, is this for me now? Maybe I'll do something else. And I got this offer to go to France, which I'd always wanted to do. And I ended up being there, yeah, for 4 years and having a great time for the most part until the end. So I set the book over that 4 years. And actually, the 2 books that I sort of based it on, there was a book called Inside French Rugby by a New Zealand guy who'd been a very good player, but not an international player. But he played for Montpellier, I think mostly, or he finished at Montpellier in France. And the other one, which I just thought was the gold standard of any sports book I'd read, was Barbarian Days by William Finnegan, because I
Yeah,
just thought,
yeah. I mean, absolute classic. Yeah,
yeah, the kind of
he's on
insight.
the list.
Yeah, it was like that sort of level of.
That's interesting. So you right. So that like why would you why that book?
I just thought it had a level of insight, and it had his. I mean, he was an amateur, really. You know, he was a journalist and a teacher and everything else, but he was an amazing surfer. Clearly, you know.
Yeah, I mean, he obviously fucking rips. Like, there's no doubt
Yeah,
about that.
and
Yeah,
like still as an old boy, you know, going out to Tavera and just, like,
yeah, yeah,
all
yeah,
that
yeah. I
stuff.
mean, some of the stuff in that book where I'm like, yeah, you could definitely surf.
Yeah,
You're definitely
but
better than me.
yeah, and me, yeah, and I think
No,
but it
right,
had.
but it's so interesting because in surfing, it's like, it was one of those, it's like it's just incredible. Yeah, that so super interesting to hear that it had that impact on you as well. Because, I mean, first thing to say about that book, just if we're going to digress down that road, like it's fucking hard to write about surfing, like
Mm,
the experience. I mean,
yeah,
not for it not to be shit.
yeah. I can imagine it's easy to get really overwrought and
Yeah.
you know.
I mean, there's like a talk about purple prose and a lot of
Mm,
shit writing about the experience of surfing. So I think that was from. I think that's one of the reasons in the surf culture is, I guess, is what I'm saying, why like it struck such a chord with people because everyone was like, "Oh, right, this is actually somebody who can actually write about this in a convincing, incredible way." And then clearly, like he's got a great story
mm.
and he can fucking write, can't he? So,
I think it had this mix of like this deep kind of, for a surf like outsider, you know, this deep kind of technical. It didn't patronize you. It was like, this is what's happening, but it also, like you said, it had this journey, and also it kind of touched it at this kind of more emotional, spiritual, you know, purposeful. What am I doing when I'm doing this? How does it feel? And
yeah,
I thought, oh, if I can communicate any of that at any point, you know, then
yeah,
I've
that's
done
so
my job.
interesting. That's so interesting. I'm reading Nana Cherry's
I
autobiography at the
saw,
minute.
yeah, yeah. How is it? Because I've got it on the shelf
It's
somewhere.
really, really good, actually. Yeah, it's really, really good. But I guess it's a bit of a similar thing to Barbarian Days or any of those sort of. It's just really convincing.
Mm,
Essentially, end of the day, like it's you really get clearly someone like Nana Cherry is like a fucking one-off, right? Broke the molds, and you understand why. But also, it's got a lot of interesting things to say about um, family and um, you know, almost like how you create a family environment in a very hectic, non-traditional way, which I'm finding quite poignant and interesting. Yeah, I really recommend it, and I think if you like Barbarian Days, you'd probably get a similar thing out of it. But anyway, we massively digress, which I guess is the point of these
yeah, that's
conversations.
the
But
point. Yeah,
but like I got a quick question for you about your career, if that's all right. So,
go on.
um, what were your ambitions when you started your professional career?
I think I was foolish in a way to not really set some clear goals for myself, and I think I was almost too exploratory. I had vague, oh, I'll do as well as I can and see where that goes. And then I did always have a kind of lingering, oh, I'd love to go to France. So I think
Let
like,
me let me rephrase that if that's all right. Like, because obviously, did you real? Let me put it like, did you realize your career, as you used the phrase, would be on the fringes, or was that like a realization as your career progressed?
but no, that was definitely as it progressed. So I sort of delayed it in order to go to university and do an English literature degree, which I couldn't do in Bath, where I was from. And Bath's a very small place. So while I loved the club, they weren't exactly kind of forthcoming with a lot of money for me to hang around. And I couldn't do the degree I wanted to do anywhere nearby. So I ended up going up to Newcastle and kind of getting into the scene there, where there's lots of sort of semi-pro teams you can go and play, you know, and get a lot of games. And
Yeah,
after that, I went professional, and I did very well in my first year as a professional. I kind of thought, oh, I'm going to kind of be on the up and up.
yeah,
And after 2 years, I had a like kind of move to a better team fall through, and I was left without a deal. And sort of for the first time in my life, I was just sat with nothing to do, even though I knew exactly what I wanted, and that was really, really hard.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do. And now I recognize that as like being depressed, whereas at the time, I was just waiting for the phone to ring and sort of doing half-hearted bits of fitness and weights, really.
Yeah.
And people
'Cause
were
and
saying,
you, yeah, I
yeah,
bet you were young, right? How old were you?
oh, yeah, 24 maybe 20,
Yeah, right. So
and in
it's
the
a challenging situation to be in.
yeah, and in the end, I was sort of talking to teams about different things, but I thought, right, fuck it, I'm going to get out of my own hole. And I basically went to Sydney, which I'd always quite fancied going to that side of the world and playing some rugby. And I only meant to go for 3 months, but I had a great time and I got a job coaching in a private school. So I was doing that and then I was playing as well. And I got a barista qualification. So I was kind of opening this cafe. In the afternoon, I'd go and coach, and then in the evening, I'd train. And on the weekend, I'd play a game and just hang out at the beach and go out drinking and had a great time. So I would have stayed there longer, but I had an offer to come back to the UK to play professionally again. And
Right.
then that in Cornwall, actually, at Cornish Pirates. And then that year went kind of okay, but not great. And I just thought, I've not really enjoyed this. I don't, maybe it's not my thing. And by that time, I was kind of 25, and you just think, well, if you don't crack whatever the next level is right now, it's probably not going to happen. And
Yeah.
then I had this France offer, so I thought, well, I'll just go and do something else different and learn French and kind of get into that whole thing, which I did. So I think at that point, I sort of knew that unless things kind of progressed for me in France, then I wasn't going to be doing what I wanted, what I thought I might do when I started, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I just always like the thing about anything with that involves ambition, right? Is and I would say professional sport obviously involves ambition is, or you could call it drive, couldn't you? Whatever you want to call it, like it requires you imagining a future for yourself in some um ambitious way, right? Like you have to think you can make it. Sure,
Yeah.
like I'm not a professional sports person. I'm more asking you for your insights on this, really. Um, and I have been looking of like a lot of my friends were really successful professional athletes, and I'm still friends with people who are like really successful professional athletes. And I just find that element of the psychology is so interesting. There's almost like an act of cognitive dissonance goes on, isn't there? That you have to tell yourself that you will succeed, because if you can't believe it, you won't succeed. Like there's a sort of paradox there. But then, like my experience of seeing my friends has always been that their ambitions have never actually matched the outcome. The ones that actually achieve their ambitions are very, very rare, and everyone else has to sort of reconcile the position that they end up in. And that's if I'm making sense, that can be challenging for people. That can be that's something that can be, and you see it. I'm a huge football fan. You see it in professional sport all the time, don't you? When or like young people coming through and their expectations that they're gonna have this amazing career, and they might have like Emma Raducanu. I mean,
Mm.
like she might well end up having an amazing career, but like obviously it's coming at that level, and now it's like, well, where's she going to end up here? Like, and how's this gonna? So just find it like super fascinating, and obviously, the fact you've called your book Fringes and it's about this topic, yeah, just like um, an
I
interesting question.
I think a lot of athletes are in their own respect on the fringes. When I talk to people, it's quite often there's basically a pyramid, isn't there? And everyone's dissatisfied. And even if you make that very top level, you probably have a dissatisfaction inherent to you where you can always do better. I think there's something in the Arsene Wenger book about Cesc Fabregas and Thierry Henry where he said they were never happy. They were never
Yeah,
happy with what they did with their performance. They always thought they could have had a better game, and that's kind of sad in a way. Those are those are like the two best players he'd coached in a way. And I think the other thing is someone's always coming for you at the top of that pyramid, so you always
Yeah,
have
yeah, yeah.
to, keep moving and keep moving on. A bit like in a weird way, what you're saying in your piece about your business model is like, yeah, you've got to keep going, got to keep evolving. If you stand still, someone's coming for you. And in
Yeah,
sport, I think people that it sort of suits in a way people that like exams in a weird way. You're almost being tested all the time, and
sure.
and it gi- and it and
That's
it,
quite a
gi-
funny way of putting it, but I
and
do understand. Well, it's structured, isn't it?
yeah,
It's
exactly.
very structured,
It gives
you
you a
know.
game. It gives you little games to play every day. You're in the gym. Can I beat yesterday? You've
Yeah,
got a game on the weekend. Can I be better than that guy, or can I be better than I was last time? And yeah, so you're constantly getting feedback. And actually, I think one of the ways athletes struggle when they stop playing sport is they go into kind of normal work and they don't get any feedback and they don't
yeah.
really know what to do because they're
Got to
so
cook their own dinner.
exactly, yeah. they're
Yeah,
so they're so used to people sort of telling them what to do or telling them, oh, that was great, now do this, and you're like, okay,
yeah,
great, and
yeah, yeah, yeah. But your point about drive is really interesting, isn't it? You use those examples of like Sesk and whoever, but like I think also it's a similar thing with creativity, isn't it? You've written books, you've done big projects, like there's a similar trick going on there, isn't there? Like to get yourself up for the like, oh, I can do this, it's going to be good. Is that you've got to sort of get yourself in that mindset, and there is an element of drive and ambition involved in that as well, like that you're sort of saying to yourself, yeah, this will be good enough. Like I can do this because that's why there's so many like unfinished novels in drawers, isn't
yeah.
there? And like and but then again, like it's the obverse, like you say, like but then you complete it and the the kind of, oh wow, that wasn't good enough, I need to do it again, like is funny, isn't it? It's not often that healthy, I don't think, really.
No, and people always ask you what you're doing next as soon as you've done it. So
Yeah,
there's a great clip. I think his name's Scotty Scheffler. I'm not a golf kind of fan, but it was literally yesterday. I think he's one of the best golfers in the world. And he was talking about winning the majors, and he was saying, "Oh, you feel great for a couple of hours, and then you just suddenly feel the same, or you start thinking about whatever's next." And he was sort of saying the whole thing feels very pointless sometimes, or very,
yeah. I mean,
yeah, which was,
is it like Mourinho that like just wouldn't take the medal kind of thing? Like, yeah, no, I don't want that, mate. Like,
yeah,
because that, like, no, 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 I'm already on to the next thing. Like Roy Keane is famously like that, isn't it? Like,
yeah. I think
no,
in,
I don't even want the medal. Like, I'm
there's,
already moving on.
I think particularly with creative work though, I think there's this like, it's a weird optimism that you're like, oh no, my best work's gonna happen. Actually, it's like, whatever I've done is what I've done. But like I've got something else. I've got something else in me. I
Yeah,
know I do. And you think that is a kind of insane optimism to have in some respects. And you said Emma Raducanu, she in some ways she's one of Britain's greatest ever tennis players. Technically by sort of dint of what she's achieved. But yeah, you can't help but think, oh, this must all be disappointing for you.
well, I think I mean, in her case, it was just expectations were set very
Mm,
high early on, weren't they?
yeah.
Yeah. How interesting! I'm definitely going to read your book.
We-
Because like, and I'm also going to read the. I recommend the Paul Kimmage one if you've not read it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, because yeah, it won the William Hill, didn't it, the tennis one, and that's usually an indicator that it's worth reading.
What's
Um,
the have you got any like sort of other sort of, I don't think we've really touched enough on, it seems to me, looking from the outside, that like adventure, you're talking about Wilbur Smith, and then, you're sort of, people talk about the sports that you sort of covered and that you're interested in as kind of action sports, but in a way they're adventure sports, aren't they? And I think that those writers back in the day, they were going on these outrageous adventures and, these long articles, whereas now it's like the content, all these athletes are almost, you can almost make a career that's sort of to the side of any kind of competitive activity.
yeah,
It's purely adventure based. It's purely showcasing that stuff. So I was interested in like the theme of adventure sort of for you, and what books maybe touch on that as well.
yeah, yeah, sure, yeah. I'll have book wise, I'll have to have a think about that. But like, yeah, you raise an interesting point, and yeah, I think those. So I've really based my life around those pursuits. You know, since like I said, since I was like 14, I've been skateboarding. Not anymore. I'm too old. But like you know, I've dedicated. That's what I've done my whole life. And they were always a vehicle for travel, really. Like the 10 years that I ran White Lines, the snowboarding magazine, and I was lucky enough to travel the world snowboarding for like about 15 years all in. And it was just it was a vehicle to meet people and to travel. Like and obviously I love snowboarding, and obviously I love the act of you know, and same with surfing now. But as important are the opportunities that it unlocks for you, like the to meet people, to travel. So for me, that's what it was always about, really. And on the literature point, yeah, I mean, do you know what? Like, actually, like it was intrinsically linked. Now that you mention it, because and this is how much of a pretentious wanker I am, really. But like, so like
Look at the pair of
I
us.
did a snowboard trip to Iran. I did a snowboard
Oh
trip to
wow!
Iran
Yeah,
basically because I'd read Road to Oceania by Robert Byron, which is basically like so do you know that book, Road to Oceania?
I absolutely don't.
Right, Robert Byron, I mean, he's like considered the sort of dawn of like post-war travel writers. And he's, you know, he's like it's very he's a stylist. Like it's a tragic story actually. He was killed. He was killed in the Second World War. He was on a boat that got torpedoed. But he was like a very famous guy. Like, and he went to he was, you know, he's like Oxford
I've heard the
educated.
name for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and he travelled all over the Middle East. And he wrote a book. God, it's so long since I've read him, but like I can't like he wrote a really famous book about a monastery in Greece, and he wrote a really famous book called The Road to Oxiana, which I read about through Bruce Chatwin. So this is
Oh
where you
yes, the
get
Patagonian
into
guy.
yeah, like so, and he cited it as his like favorite ever travel book. So I was like, oh, I'm going to read that. And in Road to Oxiana, basically, Robert Byron does this trip from Istanbul. So Oxiana is it's an area in the Himalayas, between India and Afghanistan, and that part of the world. It's 20 years since I read it, so I can't really remember the details. But ultimately, it was like an overland journey, and he goes through Iran, and like he goes to Isfahan in Iran,
Mm.
and he basically writes this passage about the Sheikh Luftullah Mosque in Isfahan, which is w- like is a very famous passage, um, and it had a big impact on me at the time. So like I decided I was going to go and see it, and my vehicle to do that was to organise a snowboarding trip to Iran, for White Lines. So basically, I pitched my boss. This is like 90. No, this is like 2004.
Wow.
They were going to go to Iran, and he was like, "Okay." Also, I should say that like there had been some snowboard trips to Iran previously. So there's a really famous guy called Craig Kelly who'd been to Iran, which I'd seen, and there'd been an article in an American magazine where they'd gone to Iran. So again, it's this intersection of ideas, right? And influences. So I was like, oh, right, they've been and done it. So I could go and do that as well. So I basically organized this trip with a load of friends. And it was amazing. Like, and we flew to Tehran. We had to do it through like the Iranian government because they just made us like get media visas and made us like do like an organized thing, which we were quite nervous about at the time. But then we met the guides, and they were just amazing. So we spent 3 weeks traveling around Iran, and we went snowboarding because north of Tehran there's these really good resorts, and we spent a week snowboarding up there for about 10 days. Fucking amazing. Like proper mountains, like 4,000 meters, some of them. And then we drove around Iran afterwards, and we went to Isfahan, and I got to have my pretentious moment much to the bafflement of my friends, who were like, "We're going where?" I was like, "We're going to go to this town called Isfahan, which is a 10-hour drive away." And they were just like, "Yeah, whatever, fuck it, we're driving around Iran. This is great." So we went there. We went to Kashan. We went to Qom, I think it's called, which is Khomeini's like hometown. Um, and yeah, it was great. It was really great. And I did a lot of that through the snowboarding stuff that I did. I also I did a trip to Uzbekistan for similar reasons. I read a book that I really liked, and that was all set in Tashkent. And I was like, all right, I'm going to go there. But I was lucky enough to like have that as a vehicle. So yeah, I did do that. I kind of forgot about that. Like not the trip, because the trip was like incredibly formative. And the final thing I say about that trip is that we we had a brilliant time, and just as we were leaving, we had about 3 days left, and the guide Mahmood, who's a fucking legend, and he was like, "Right, you owe me 8 grand," and I was like, "Cool, take Visa," and he was like, "No," and I was like, "Oh, okay," and he's like, "Are you taking the piss?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he was like, "Well, there's sanctions. Of course, we don't take Visa." And he's like, "You didn't bring cash," and I was like, "No," um, and he was like, "Okay, well, you're not going to be able to leave because it's a government thing." So he was cool. He wasn't like threatening us or anything. He was
Yeah.
just a bit like, okay, this is like quite a problem. And we were like, okay, fuck. He said, well, what you could do is I've got a BBC film crew coming out, and this is before we got to Isfahan. And he's like, and we're gonna meet them in Isfahan. So you could try and get them to bring the money. And I was like, okay. So I ended up phoning my mate in Brighton and saying, "Can you lend me 8 grand?" Which he did, which he agreed. And then I was like, "Okay, now you got to take it to a guy in London who's going to fly it to Tehran." And he was like, "You've been kidnapped."
Yeah, yeah.
No, no, we haven't been kidnapped.
Not quite. Not yet.
We're just
Yeah.
absolute fuckwit,
Yeah.
basically. And they did it. They actually did it. Like so like I phoned this woman and I was like, "This hello." This is gonna sound weird. And she like incredibly, she was just like, "Yeah, all right. Yeah, time to give me the money."
I
And
think they deal with some weird shit. The BBC, like with those
yeah,
kinds of those
they
kinds of
just
trips.
they just did it. Yeah. And so it became one of those like funny stories that you can tell 20 years later. Although at the time we were quite stressed. Um, Mahmood thought it was fucking hilarious. He was like, "Wow, you Westerners are idiots." Like, yeah, you're probably right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also just the idea of like taking 8 grand out, putting it in your bag, and then like yoking it round Iran for like 2 weeks, 3 weeks before you hand it over, and you're just like, well, you think obviously I wouldn't do that, and he's like, well, no, why haven't you?
Well, it was
It's
just
like,
a bit
yeah,
like, well, you don't know the sanctions.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
oh yeah, now you mention that, I'd heard about that. Yeah, but we like 27, idiot. So yeah. Um,
yeah.
hey
There we
man, well,
go.
this has been great. I
Yeah,
think I'm gonna have
let's
to. I'm
let's
gonna have to
call it.
wrap it.
I
Yeah,
feel like I'm a couple of beers behind you, so I need to go and catch up. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah. But that was nice that everyone stayed on. Thank you
yeah.
if you tuned in. That was kind. So what
Clearly,
happens
we
with
weren't
these?
entirely tedious. Yeah,
Can we share them?
Can we share what this?
Yeah. How does
Yeah,
it
yeah,
work? Is it
yeah.
like Insta?
Yeah, yeah, it'll kind of save and then it gives you a transcript and all that sort of stuff. So
Oh, that's
we
cool.
we can do that.
Yeah. Well, it was really nice to meet you, and thanks for the
Yeah, you
invite.
too. What a treat. And yeah, have fun in Normandy. I'm very jealous.
Yeah, yeah. Nice. All right.
Nice.
Cheers,
All right.
man.
Cheers, Matt. Bye bye.